Be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation podcast network.
You're listening to Healthcare Matters, the podcast that pulls back the curtain to help you make sense of complex healthcare economics and policy issues. With us is Dr. Robert Popovian in Washington, D.C. He's a pharmacist, an economist, and the Chief Science Policy Officer at the Global Healthy Living Foundation.
Joining me, as always, is my good friend, Ben Blanc, from the heartland of the United States, Indianapolis, Indiana. He's our Director of Digital Production and Engagement at GHLF. So, Ben, there's been a few tornadoes going on in the Midwest. Have you guys been affected there in Indianapolis?
Yes, Indianapolis was definitely affected, and thankfully my neighborhood remained safe. It's been pretty bad in my area, lots of downed trees and power outages, and if I may draw a comparison with the news, it's not the only storm that we're weathering at the moment. It's actually hard to keep up with everything. We've all heard about the sweeping layoffs and contract cuts at the Department of Health and Human Services. On top of losing around 10,000 staff, HHS has also been ordered to slash contract spending by 35% across all agencies, and that includes the CDC, the NIH, and the FDA.
That's exactly right, Ben. We'll get more into our discussion with our guest today that we brought on specially to talk about the issues going on at HHS, specifically related to the Food and Drug Administration. But at the end of the day, it's not a matter of reduced staff, because, there have been other presidents, as recently as Bill Clinton, for example. He reduced the number of employees in the federal level by about 400,000, but that occurred over an 8-year period, and it was very much attrition related. But it's that, who are you replacing, and what are you stopping, and who's leaving voluntarily, that we're going to have a discussion about with our guest today.
And as you said, Robert, today we're diving into a timely and important topic, and we'll talk about the leadership changes at the FDA, what they might mean for the future of healthcare, biopharmaceutical innovation, and patient access. Personnel may come and go, but at a powerful agency like the Food and Drug Administration, individual appointments can have lasting effects on science, policy, and public trust. And today we're joined by Peter Pitts, former Associate Commissioner of the FDA and President of the Center for Medicine in the Public Interest. In this episode, Peter will help us unpack what's happening inside the agency and beyond, and why it matters for patients, providers, and policymakers alike. So let's get started. Hi, Peter. Thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks very much for having me.
So, Peter, before we dive into today's topic, can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your background, especially your experience at the FDA and what led you to your current work in health policy?
Well, I guess what's most relevant, Ben, is that, as you said, I'm a former FDA Associate Commissioner, and one of the areas under my authority when I was there was the Office of Communications. So I certainly understand how the thought might be that there are too many communicators in every HHS agency, and then putting them together might be a good idea. But I guess overall, my view as a former FDA official is it's always more complicated than you think, and you've got to look not just to the numbers, but to what those functions do, who they coordinate with, what's required by law, what's important to advance innovation. And I guess what's most important is to maintain both the safety and efficacy and quality of all the products overseen by the FDA, those on the market and those yet to come.
Thanks, Peter. So let's start this episode with some context for our listeners. Can you help us understand how the FDA's leadership is structured and how much influence key personnel like commissioners or division heads actually have on shaping long-term health policy?
The FDA is a very hierarchical organization. It's a pyramid. And by that, I mean, when the guy at the top, the commissioner, says, here's my priority, here's what I want to accomplish, everybody generally lines up, salutes, and makes that their priority as well. But that being said, the commissioner is one of a handful, and by handful, I mean 5 or fewer employees at the entire FDA, of about 18,000 employees, fewer these days, who are Schedule Cs or political appointees. The overwhelming majority of the rest of those folks are career public health officials. And what's also important to note is that in the review centers, specifically CDER for drugs, CBER for biologics and vaccines, and CDRH for medical devices, 100% of those employees, from the director at the top to the newest hire at the very bottom, are completely non-political. They are 100% career public health officials. So I think it's important to recognize. So in the past, people have dinged the FDA for making what they might have considered quote unquote political decisions. But there's really no rhyme or reason to that, because there's no place else for people to get their programs licensed other than the FDA. So there's no real pressure that can be brought to bear, because the FDA is the only place that you can go. So whether it's accusations of industry running the FDA or FDA being in industry's pocket because of user fees, that makes no sense at all. So I think one of the key discussion points now, with Marty Makary now confirmed and sitting in the seat of commissioner, is he going to be an independent voice for science representing the FDA to the administration, or will he simply be a rubber stamp for decisions that the administration wants to make? Now, in my experience with Dr. Makary, he's a stand-up guy. He's very smart. He's keen on innovation, and he's nobody's fool, and he's highly ethical. So I'm optimistic that with his hands on the tiller, things aren't going to be, on the one hand, as bad as people think. And in fact, they might be better. That being said, I wish that he had been consulted prior to the most recent round of RIFs, so that he could have had a handle on where that might lead. My concern was that the RIFs seemed to have really no rhyme or reason. And just the other day, Secretary Kennedy said that they're in fact going to have to hire back a bunch of people that they laid off. Not a great way to start your commissionership.
Thanks, Peter. That's really helpful context. And now let's talk about what's really unfolding today. You started talking about it, but there's been a lot of buzz about recent and upcoming personnel changes at the FDA. From your vantage point, what changes matter most? And why should patients, providers, and policymakers be paying attention?
Well, there's no real reason that anybody should be paying attention other than if they want innovation to continue inside the FDA. When you denude an agency of its senior leadership, when you cut the tendons of the connective wires that allow everybody to work closely together, things slow down. You can't drive faster with your eyes closed. You want to make sure that you don't sacrifice safety and quality by going too fast. And what the agency has been able to do over the past several years, say 5 to 10 years, is really move a lot quicker while maintaining safety and efficacy. And in fact, in many respects, improving it because of technology and other tools of 21st century science. So I think the reasons patients should care, quite simply, is, with a understaffed, less connected, more cautious FDA, fewer new medical products will reach the market. And that's the bottom line.
Yeah, thanks for sharing the bottom line here. Now, it sounds like these changes could have ripple effects beyond the agency itself. And I'd love to get both of your takes on this. So what do these shifts mean for the future of biopharmaceutical innovation in the US? Short and long term? And are there any specific treatment areas or regulatory pathways most at risk?
Well, first of all, you have a relatively new director at CDRH, the Medical Devices Center. You have an acting director at CDER, the Drug Center, and you have an acting director at CBER for Drugs and Biologics. The previous director at CBER, Peter Marks, was very keen to work with industry and patient groups and academics to bring new types of thinking to regulatory science. In fact, a lot of products came to market over the objection of career staff who were kind of mired in the status quo. Patrizia Cavazzoni at CDER similarly was, I think, a big thinker, and she's gone. So the first job of Dr. Makary is going to have to figure out who his senior leadership team is going to be. And I think he's well placed to make a smart decision. Nothing's going to happen fast because these positions are tough to hire. That's a problem. My question is Dr. Makary going to be allowed by Secretary Kennedy to make his own decisions? I certainly hope that he is.
And that's the big question, right, Ben? What Peter brought up at the end. Does Dr. Makary, which I also agree with Peter, I think he's a straight shooter, he's very ethical. He's done a ton of research when he was at Johns Hopkins on the topic of therapeutics, both on devices and on pharmaceuticals, I believe. But the issue is he going to be allowed to pick people who are going to be as innovation focused as the folks that we lost recently through the FDA? And personally, I think that short term, there's a lot of uncertainty for the biopharmaceutical industry. Long term, it's still somewhat uncertain because it depends on who those positions are going to be filled with and whether or not they're going to have the vision of those past leaders that we had. What therapeutic areas are impacted? Frankly, one of the areas that I'm concerned about is oncology. Oncology is the lifeblood of innovation that's going on by the pharmaceutical industry. There's a lot of research that's been funded. There's a lot of hope that's coming for cancer patients. And if this hope is stopped or even slowed, it's going to impact patients' lives. And that's not what we want to see. I know that putting everything else aside, what the FDA has done in the last decade or 2 decades with regards to cancer therapies, it's amazing where we are today compared to where we were 20 years ago with the therapeutics that we have and the hope that we give for patients.
That's a key point because, Secretary Kennedy talks about radical transparency, and I've been talking a lot about creative destruction, which means sometimes a little destruction is good. It moves things forward. The problem with that is the counterpoint to chaos is predictability. And when it comes to things like industry having the faith to invest in innovative, expensive therapeutic programs, they want the predictability relative to how the regulatory process is going to work. The reason that the industry likes user fees isn't so much that they get a date certain, although that certainly is important, but because they have a predictable date when things are going to happen. And that allows them to plan going forward. Radical transparency, I'm all for that. We haven't seen it. We've seen a lot of chaos. Chaos is not the friend to innovation. Chaos sends a signal to investors that say, slow down and stop. And they're going to wait until things become more predictable. That's what money does. That's why when the stock market is as volatile as it is today, people take their money out and they put it on the sidelines. They're waiting for the right time to act. If pharmaceutical innovators think now is not the time to invest in gene therapy, in CAR T, in oncology programs, in rare and orphan and ultra rare diseases, that's bad news for patients, but it's smart financial investing. And you want financial investing and what's best for the patient to be on the same page. And right now they're at counterpoint, and that's frightening.
And that's what I'm more concerned about, is that what are the patients who are right now struggling with certain disease areas, especially in oncology, that are looking for the next therapy to come on? Because we've known this, Peter, right? You and I have talked about this on multiple occasions. Cancer care has become a chronic care where you're waiting for the next innovation to come out for you to get a few more years of life. What if that's delayed? What happens to all of these patients then? And that's what its uncertainty brings. And it's a very difficult, trying situation for these individuals right now.
Another thing that we need to take into consideration, it's not the FDA acting on its own in a silo. FDA works, for example, with CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, relative to getting new drugs coded so they can be reimbursed. Even during the Biden administration, FDA approved a lot of very innovative drugs in very innovative 21st century ways, led by Dr. Marks and Drs. Capizone. And CMS said, we're not sure we want to reimburse for these products because we don't necessarily agree with the scientific methodologies that the FDA use. That's unfortunate and incorrect mission creep. So another issue relative to Secretary Kennedy is smoothing the relationships between the agencies under his authority, FDA, CMS, CDC, NIH, and he hasn't appointed anybody to be overall in charge, kind of an innovation czar. But for things to happen more smoothly with fewer people, there needs to be somebody in charge of the innovation process, of the interagency relationship process. And I'm waiting for that to start happening. And maybe I'll be waiting in vain, but Robert and I have been talking about this for years, so maybe finally somebody's going to listen.
We've been talking about this on our podcast, how diversion between what the FDA label is and CDC recommendations creates confusion in the marketplace, especially with providers and patients. So is this an opportunity to really align these two agencies to make sure that patients, for example, with vaccines, are following FDA labeled indication rather than somewhat different recommendations coming from the CDC, which then creates chaos for patients in the marketplace?
Chaos and confusion. And that was one of the dings relative to, for example, approving the COVID vaccine for kids. The FDA said one thing, and then the president weighed in that he agreed, so that before the CDC committee even voted or even started talking, the fix was in. So I think that, relative to restoring people's faith in our public health agencies, it's got to be more transparent for sure. But it's also got to be more smartly communicated and coordinated. Otherwise, people just think that the federal government doesn't know which way is up.
Thank you both for providing further insights about how the different agencies work together. Now let's talk a bit more specifically about policies being shaped. Robert, you talked about innovation in oncology. Peter, you talked about CAR T. So beyond leadership, and that actually leads perfectly into the next question, because it's not just about who's at the helm, but what policy directions they're steering. So beyond leadership, what are the other major policy or regulatory issues currently at play that could impact the pace or direction of drug innovation in the US?
Well, a key thing, you mentioned the word policy development. Well, guess who got laid off? The people who do policy development. And when it comes to FDA, these are very technical propositions. You can't say, I'm an expert in healthcare policy, therefore I can help develop specific FDA guidance on how to develop cures for Duchenne's muscular dystrophy or enhanced labeling indications for GLP-1 drugs. You need to have not just the people who are paid through user fees, the reviewers, but the people who support them, librarians, support staff, but also all the other people inside places like CBER, CEDAR, and CDRH whose job is to think about evolving policy propositions. And those people, by and large, had been let go. There is nobody left in the federal government to develop these policies. It's a travesty. It's a mistake. And hopefully, of the people that Secretary Kennedy wants to bring back, a large portion of those will be the senior staff who are tasked with thinking smart thoughts relative to 21st century FDA policy. It does not happen by itself.
Look, it's always been very difficult to recruit individuals to come to the FDA, to come to the NIH, to come to CDC to work, especially smart pharmacists, physicians, PhDs, and so on. Is this uncertainty, is the way that these folks are now reacting to the news that's coming out of these agencies, is that going to make it even harder for individuals who are on top of their scientific world to then come and work for these agencies as experts? That's a big question.
Let me double click on that. It's always hard to go to work for the federal government. There's a lot of bureaucracy in hiring. No comment there. Can it be made better? Sure. But it's tough. But what's even tougher is that if you're a senior researcher and you're leaving your postdoc, for example, or you work at a pharmaceutical company, you want to try something different, you're taking a pay cut, a significant pay cut, going to work for the FDA. And the reason people do it, and good, solid people do it, brilliant people do it, because in their heart and soul, they want to do something to advance the public health. Working at agencies like the FDA is almost a cult because people believe it in their souls. And you may not agree with any individual decision that the agency makes, but I'm telling you that the people that make those decisions make them because they really believe it's the best thing to do. So when people look at the chaos now that's going on and potentially could go on for quite a while, where they look at the budget cuts and also the lack of respect that Secretary Kennedy seems to have for people at FDA, they're going to go, you know what? Would have loved to have done it. I'm not going to. And that basically says the only people you're going to get at the FDA is the B team. And that's not acceptable. What you need at the FDA is the best and the brightest, full stop. And that also relates to people, for example, that you recruit to serve on advisory committees. When you say things like, we can't have anybody on an advisory committee that has ever done work for the pharmaceutical industry, well, that's your entire A team. That is the best and the brightest. And you have to recognize that we shouldn't be calling things conflicts of interests. They're interests, sure. And you've got to identify them. You've got to protect against them. But you can't look at people and say, if you've ever done work for a pharmaceutical company, you can't be on the FDA team. That's just naive.
Thanks, Peter. And now, Robert, I'm turning to you. Let's now look at things from the industry's perspective. So with your background in both science policy and as a former executive in the pharma industry, how do you think today's FDA environment is influencing how companies approach research and development, clinical trials, and even pricing strategies?
I think there's a lot of turmoil, there's a lot of uncertainty, and I would not be surprised at all, Ben, if everything is somewhat put on hold, frankly, until these questions are answered from an agency perspective. I think there's a lot of trepidation from the pharmaceutical industry to really move forward until they have more certainty about who's going to be in charge, what is the direction, are they going to be able to get their products approved, what is the requirements. That's another thing that we haven't talked about. Have the requirements shifted about product approval? I was in the 1990s with pharma companies when FDA went through a transition with regards to how they approved anti-infectives. They changed the terminology significantly. And at that point, it delayed introduction of some anti-infectives because pharma companies had to go back and redo some of those clinical trials. So there's a lot of trepidation. There's a lot of uncertainty right now that's going among the pharma companies. And again, my heart goes out to all the patients who have been waiting because they're the ones who are going to suffer. Pharma companies will be fine. It will get approved. If these drugs are worthwhile and they need to be approved, they will get approved. But a delay of a year or 2 years, it really impacts patients' lives.
Right. Also, it's not just new products as well. Companies are going to look at that pause button and say, should we spend serious money to field clinical trials for secondary additional uses for existing drugs? And that has profound implications, not just for places like oncology and rare diseases, but also for things like GLP-1s. Right now, it's all about weight loss and diabetes. It's also great for gambling addiction, cocaine problems, a whole host of other things. Shingles vaccines could potentially decrease the onset of dementia. And that's an often ignored arm of innovation. We think about new drugs, but new uses for existing drugs also extremely important and not inexpensive. And to Robert's point about anti-infectives, I remember in the 90s talking about non-inferiority trials, which sounds pretty geeky and wonky to the average person. But unless there's clarity as to a path forward, those programs don't happen either.
To tell you, Ben, one other thing I want to add to this is that when pharma companies make decisions about moving forward with innovation or label extension, like what Peter was talking about, they don't do it in a bubble just on FDA, right? There's this whole other thing that's going on with the federal government, which is the Inflation Reduction Act, which is also impacting innovation. So is this a perfect tsunami of those two coming together and these two things of IRA uncertainty with regards to the regulatory issues, with regards to the approval process at the FDA, and creating a very huge barrier for not only new drugs coming out, but these label extensions that Peter talked about, which is, are we going to invest more money to research an existing drug in the market, or we're just going to pull back everything? Because now not only we have this issue with Inflation Reduction Act with regards to price setting by the federal government that's going on that makes it difficult for us to make investment decisions, but now you have this regulatory body uncertainty that in the past we were sure that we can get something done prior to the clock starting to tick. And the important issue to also address with the pharma companies is that even though there was a lot of rhetoric prior to the election that perhaps the Inflation Reduction Act would overturned with the election of the new president coming on board, with the new Congress and everything else, there's absolutely been zero signals from this administration that they're going to do anything to take away the Inflation Reduction Act. In fact, my intelligence, and I want to hear it from Peter, is that this president is even doubling down on some of these issues, like he's trying to bring in like international price indexing or most favored nation pricing and things like that, which makes it even more difficult for pharma companies to predict the future, not only from a financial standpoint, but also a regulatory standpoint to make investments.
I'll weigh in on that because not only has the Trump administration said that they are not going to take a different direction relative to programs like 340B, which is a tremendous mistake. We're being robbed blind by hospitals and their consultants, but also things like saying we're not going to reimburse for GLP-1s, an enormous mistake. Who's advising these people? There's no consistency. There's no philosophy behind their programs. There's no foundation, which means there's no way to predict where they're going to go on any issue. It's totally scattershot. And again, that scares away faith that there's a ability to plan for the future.
Well, thanks, Peter. And that's actually a great transition because all these programs that you mentioned, all these changes, at the end of the day, they will impact the patients. So before we wrap up, I want to bring the conversation back to what matters most, patients. Peter, what should advocacy organizations like GHLF be paying attention to in terms of FDA priorities? And how do we make sure that that patient voice stays front and center, especially during times of change?
So that's a great question. In his opening remarks to FDA staff, Dr. Macri made very clear his support of innovation, his support of gene therapies and new ways of thinking about regulatory science issues. But saying is one thing, doing is something else. So patients really need to lobby hard relative to the ability of the commissioner to make the decisions as to people that are going to be hired. So they need to be advocates for the commissioner, believe it or not. But I think what's important is over the last couple of years through the FDA's patient-focused drug development program, the voice of the patient really has advanced significantly beyond kind of tellers of sad stories, not to be overly crass about it, to real partners in the regulatory process, real partners in the scientific development process, real partners in the clinical trial design process. And my fear is that with fewer people, and a lot of people who remain are very mired in the status quo, they don't really want the patient voice to be a strong voice. So Dr. Macri really has to step forward and say, not only are we not going to go backwards relative to the importance and the urgency of the patient voice, it's going to become even more important and more urgent and more embedded. And that philosophy coming from the commissioner, I think will do a lot towards sending a message to the internal people at the FDA, which is there's no backsliding, and to the investment community that's worthwhile to bring these new programs forward, and to the patient community that they have a role beyond tellers of anecdotes.
Well, thank you so much, Peter, for joining us today on the podcast and sharing your deep insights into what's really happening at the FDA and beyond. So one thing that really stood out to me is how much leadership and structure matter, not just for policy and innovation, but for patients who are counting on progress. As we heard, uncertainty in staffing, priorities, and policy direction doesn't just impact regulators or companies. It delays hope for real people waiting for the next treatment breakthrough. That's why staying engaged, advocating loudly, and holding agencies accountable is so critical right now. But I'm not the expert, so Robert, you have the last word.
First of all, thank Peter for coming on. I mean, there's no one better to explain the Food and Drug Administration than Peter Pitts. He has spent a lifetime, a career dealing with this issue, and having him on our podcast is a privilege. And actually, I hope our listeners understand the amount of intelligence and feedback that he has provided, how important that is, because at the end of the day, he knows FDA better than anyone else.
Robert, the check is in the mail.
No, I'm being sincere. I've known him for a long time, and every time I hear him talk about the Food and Drug Administration, I learn new things. But having said all of this is not just about changes at the FDA, like we talked about. It's changes at the FDA, the philosophy of the Health and Human Services that's being dictated from hierarchy of the Robert F. Kennedy Jr. It's also other things that are going on the marketplace, like the Inflation Reduction Act. Peter talked about 340B, not reimbursing for innovative drugs. These are all swirling around an area that when people invest money for innovation, they want certainty. And we are creating more and more uncertainty in this environment. And is this to the detriment of innovation long term? I believe so. And who's this going to hurt the most is the patient who's waiting for the next cure.
Well, thanks for breaking that down for us, Robert. I think that was some very valuable information for our listeners. And that wraps up today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you might be listening so you never miss an episode. And if you have a second, help spread the word by rating our podcast, writing a positive review, and sharing with your family and friends. It will help more people like you find us.
If you have any questions, thoughts, suggestions, please send us an email at podcasts@ghlf.org. We appreciate having folks like Peter come on, but we'll bring you on to be a guest on our podcast and talk about some of these issues. In our upcoming episodes, we're looking for topics, so please reach out to us.
And before you go, make sure you take a listen to some of our other great podcasts on the GHLF Podcast Network. You can find all of GHLF's podcasts at ghlf.org/listen. He's Dr. Robert Popovian.
And he's Ben Blanc. We'll see you all next time.
Be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation Podcast Network.